And now it is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker for this morning, Gene Kranz. After receiving a degree in aeronautical engineering from Parks College of St. Louis University in 1954, Mr. Kranz was commissioned in the U.S. Air Force, where he flew high-performance jet fighter planes. He was discharged from the Air Force Reserve as captain in 1972. Kranz joined the NASA Space Task Group in 1960 as the assistant flight director for Project Mercury. He assumed flight director duties for all Project Gemini missions and was branch chief for flight control operations. He was selected as division chief for flight control in 1968 and continued his duties as a flight director for the Apollo 11 lunar landing before taking over the leadership of the Apollo 13 Tiger team. He contributed his expertise to a number of other NASA missions during his career, including the Skylab program, and when that concluded, he was named Deputy Director of Flight Operations for NASA. Later, he was assigned the post of Director of Mission Operations and given the responsibility for all aspects of mission design, development, maintenance, and operations for all related mission facilities. Kranz retired from NASA in 1994 after 37 years of federal service. In April of 2000, he published a memoir of his experiences in the space program, Failure is Not an Option, Mission Control from Mercury to Apollo 13 and Beyond, which, by the way, is a New York Times bestseller. He received many awards and honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which he received from President Nixon for the Apollo 13 mission, and his designation as a distinguished member of the Senior Executive Service by President Reagan. He was enshrined in the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 2015. Mr. Kranz, it is an honor to welcome you here this morning and to welcome you to the stage.
Opportunity to say a few words this morning. I'd like to recognize and thank Cardinal DiNardo, the leadership of the diocese, and the guests here today. You know, normally my talks are always on aviation, space, and recently the first lunar landing. Topics I'm intimately familiar with. It's what I call pilot talk. But during several years ago, during an air show, I was asked by a friend who needed a speaker for the monthly Methodist Men's Club breakfast. He wanted me to speak of faith in my life. And this was the first time I'd ever been asked to speak in my faith, because it's a topic I've held personally close, but I never turn down requests from those I fly with. Here we go. When writing, I always search for a theme to focus my comments. And my theme came easier than I had expected. I have a very tolerant wife, and I have airplane pictures throughout much of the downstairs, especially the family room. These are signed and autographed and numbered prints of major air battles of the Second World War. One of the prints is of the American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers. Growing up as a newspaper boy in World War II, I read the headlines as I was folding the papers. And I always looked for the news of the Flying Tigers and their P-40 Tomahawk aircraft. Before the United States entered the war with Japan in 1941, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek contacted President Roosevelt requesting air support to slow the Japanese advance in Burma and China. 100 airmen formed the American Volunteer Group, and they flew the Curtiss P-40 aircraft with the nose painted with the tiger-sharp mouthy, carrying the insignia of the Republic of China. God is My Co-Pilot is a book written by Colonel Robert Scott. It was a daily journal published in 1943 while Scott was on the front lines in Burma and China. He flew over 400 combat missions, was shot down and crashed 7 times, and he was one of the first American aces. And Scott's book title came while talking to a doctor who was digging rivet heads and shell fragments out of his back after a Japanese shell penetrated the seat. Responding to the doctor's question, he said, "I'm not up there alone. God is my co-pilot. And I was fortunate, after retirement, I was invited to speak at the Maxwell Air Force Base, the Air Command and Staff College. And I had the good fortune to meet and know 3 of the Flying Tigers: Tex Hill, Don Lopez, and John Allison. And after each day's session with the students, we returned to our quarters at Brett Hall, and we'd sit on the porch in rocking chairs aided by a goodly supply of single malt scotch. We'd talk through the night, and I'd listen to their stories. It was incredible the faith each of these individuals had. It was a faith that carried them to accomplish their mission through combat, and faith that God brought them home every day. The practice of faith in our daily lives consists of seeing things, even the most ordinary and commonplace, in relationship to God's plan regarding our own salvation and the salvation of others. It leads me to accustom myself each day as we undertake our daily activities to glancingly look up at God to see that what we are doing and what I am doing is really His will. It also provides the ability to recognize that what the world calls chance or coincidence, in fact, is God's mark everywhere and on everything. It brought me to the belief that as a Catholic, I must conduct myself in all ways and actions so that those around me who I meet in my daily life want to emulate me. Our words and actions, though personal, have real consequences on the lives of those around us. I was born in Toledo, Ohio, August 1933, the same year that Colonel Scott graduated from pilot training. I had 2 older sisters, and we were raised during the years of the Great Depression. We lived on root crops, simple grains, squirrels, rabbits, Lake Erie perch, and fruit that was picked during the summer and canned for winter. My father, Leo Peter Kranz, was a World War I veteran, and he died when I was 7. And I have vague memories of my father. He called me Bub. He was a gentle and powerful man. And our radio sat on top of the refrigerator, and every night after supper, he would call the family together to listen to radio news, Edward R. Murrow reporting from London. And I remember him standing near the radio one night saying World War, and I did not know what he meant. We lived near Swans Creek and the railroad tracks. And I remember walking along the railroad tracks with a bucket, picking up coal that had fallen from the trains to use in our pot-bellied stove to heat our home at night. 1 bucket was 1 night's heat. The Lutheran neighborhood house across the street was where we went to get treats for learning to sing their songs, and my mother got after me for that. Using my father's life insurance, my mother, Margaret Frances Kranz, moved us to a home on the West End. We were 2 short blocks from the Willys Overland Jeep plant. And our home was a 5-minute walk from the American Legion Hall and the United Service Organization, which was established by President Roosevelt. My mother converted our home into a boarding house and shoved myself, my 2 sisters, and herself into 1 room, and she rented the remaining rooms to the soldiers, sailors, and airmen in transit who would stay with us for a week, just maybe a few days. My sisters and I listened to their stories of the great battles in land, sea, and air. And they were my heroes, my brothers. And I wanted to be just like them. We lived next door to St. Agnes Church. Went to church daily praying for victory. I was an altar boy, and many times I served at GI weddings during the morning mass. And we became attached to our GIs, often crying when they left. Some named us as next of kin. The GIs at our home provided the lessons of duty, honor, country, and one of sacrifice. When one died, we hung a Gold Star banner in the window and we prayed for him. The naval aviators who lived with us gave me the dream to fly. And 6 seconds later, while writing my book in the space program, I came to recognize that God charted my way and gave me those to teach me and establish my path. My mother provided my foundation for life, the Catholic faith, integrity, and I inherited her tough work ethic. She made me a man. The backyard of our home was the playground for St. Agnes School. And John J. McHugh, an Irish cop, after his day's work, would stop by and talk to the principal and see if any boys needed talking to. And you didn't want to be talked to by John J. McHugh. He was the surrogate father to the many in our street whose fathers were fighting overseas. The Catholic priests and nuns in grade and high school provided the discipline and many of the skills needed for our journey. And after the war, with fewer borders, I was carrying 2 jobs during high school: newspapers in the morning and A&P stock boy at night to support my mother. My office contains much of the memorabilia I keep close: flag from Iraq, a piece of the Pentagon from 9/11, aircraft models, and photos of those I flew with, drawings provided to me by kids. And over my desk is a picture of 3 nuns: Sister Caroline, Sister Patricia, and Sister Mary Mark. They knew I worked 2 jobs and they handled my work-related attendance problems each day as I arrived and departed from school. They also know that a military academy was my best and only chance of college, and they prepared me for the admission examination for the Naval Academy, and I received an appointment. But God had a different plan for me. I failed the entrance physical. My diet at work had been brownies and chocolate milk for over a year. The day I received the letter that I was not eligible for the Naval Academy, my dream died. And these 3 nuns, headed by Sister Mary Mark, picked me up, challenged me to stay the course. They taught me fortitude. My mother and Sister Mark found an Ohio Elks scholarship loan for children of deceased veterans of World War I. And I went to Parks College of St. Louis University, a Jesuit institution. And in 2 years, I obtained my aero engineering degree and received an Air Force commission and a flying assignment. And while waiting for my reporting date, I worked 7 months at McDonnell Aircraft in flight test data reduction. And God brought a brand new and very influential person into my life. Next to my mother, this is the most important person I ever grew up with. He was Harry Carroll. Harry Carroll was what today you would call a Renaissance man. He did all things well. He was a World War II bomber pilot. He was an inventor. He wrote poetry. He was an actor in dinner theater. I read his bomb group diary and wondering what kind of courage it took to climb into an aircraft for 37 missions when the survival rate was only 5 missions per crew member. Carroll was an Eagle Scout leader for the Grand Portage canoe trek along the Canadian border to Lake Superior. He is featured on CBS TV as the oldest person ever to complete outward bound mountain survival. Harry instilled in me the ability and the passion needed to lead men and women in high-risk ventures. He taught me to volunteer and assume responsibility for the results. In his words, his statement, "When you die, you want to be all used up," served me as an inspiration to continue everything I started, regardless of the cost. I often speak of his many lessons. Harry died in January 2010. His memorial service included 2 of his wartime poems that spoke of God. One is a mission prayer, asking God for protection for his crew. Another one was Islands in the Sky, describing cloud formations. And he concluded with, "I sometimes think this heaven so far from worldly sod is a playground for the angels and a resting place for God." God served as Harry's co-pilot in 37 combat missions, and he was buried with his poems and a set of wings I wore flying air shows in the B-17 Flying Fortress, the same aircraft he flew during the war. There were others who continued to form and teach me. Jack Coleman, my primary flight instructor, gave me the courage and confidence to face the risk of flying on the very edge of my airplane's performance. And I moved to flying jets at Laughlin Air Force in Del Rio, Texas. Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas. Lieutenant Wendell Dobbs taught me total commitment, no reserve, nothing held back. Then one person in my life who I did not even know charted a new course for the rest of my life. The Catholic chaplain, Captain Henry Bielski, arranged a picnic for the pilots with young men from the sodality at Our Lady of Refuge Church in Eagle Pass, Texas. My flying partner was Tony Zielinski. We were the only two Catholics among the 30 who attended. And there God introduced me to a beautiful young Catholic woman, Marta Cadena. A second barbecue followed. Marta and I had about 3 to 4 dates, and I invited her to pin my wings on at graduation from flight training. My next assignment took me to Top Gun School, Fighter Weapons School at Combat Training in Las Vegas. Our instructors were the aces returning from Korea. We were flying the fastest aircraft in the world, and I began dating a nurse at the base. While showing off, a bunch of pilots and I broke my wrist in a water skiing accident, was grounded. And God changed my flight plan. I was forced to slow down. And I called the young woman who had pinned my wings. And God was my co-pilot as I've been driving weekends between Las Vegas and Eagle Pass. 2,200 miles each weekend to visit just for a few hours. After Top Gun, I was transferred to the 355th Fighter Squadron at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, South Carolina. And at Christmas that year, Marta and I met at the Toledo Mercy Hospital nurses' home. My mother was now the house mother. We were engaged Christmas Eve at a mission church. It was snowing as we left. It was one of the happiest days of our life. On April 27th, 1 year from the day Marta pinned my wings, we were married in the 3-day pass in Eagle Pass, Texas. With the day and a half on the return trip of 1,000 miles was really a challenge. Texas was flooding, cattle were on the highways, everything was blocked up. About 1.5 days later, I parked my wife in the Goldsboro Motel, and I returned to my squadron. I was now flying the most powerful aircraft in the world, riding the Thunder in the supersonic F-100. We were commanded by America's top living ace, Colonel Francis Kabreski. We were living in a beach house surrounded by other pilots. It was the springtime of our life, and the world was ours. But our spring rapidly ended. In San Francisco, 3 months after our wedding, we kissed, and Marta sent me off to Korea. Pregnant, she returned to her parents in Eagle Pass. I was assigned to a fighter bomber squadron stationed at K-55, Osan, Korea, 40 miles south of Seoul. Our aircraft was the famous MiG killer, the F-86 Sabre. I had my own aircraft and crew chief. The pilots' names and the aircraft left side. My darling Marta, after my wife. And my crew chief's selected name, Miss Judy. He painted it on his right side. And the bonding between the pilot and his crew chief is absolute, is essential and critical to safe flight. K-55 Osan was a base, very fortunate base with a Catholic chaplain. On arrival at the base, we were provided a small prayer book, Reflections and Prayers for Wartime by Monsignor Fulton Sheen. Flight duties were assigned. K-55 maintained 5-minute alert status. And the crew chiefs and the pilots slept in trailers, wrote letters, played cards. But when the klaxon sounded, we had to scramble 2 flights of aircraft within 5 minutes. Other aircraft would move into our locations and revetments as we left. Our flying was heady, exciting, challenging, and many times sitting alert in the cockpit, often for hours, waiting for the scramble klaxon. I would pull out this little prayer book, reading, more than ever. I feel the need of having thee close to me at any moment. I may find myself in combat. However rigorous the duty that awaits me, may I fill my duty with honor and courage. Like Colonel Scott, when the klaxon sounded, God's hand was on the stick in the aircraft. As a new flight leader, I experienced the heavy weight of the responsibility for others' lives. On a ferry flight from Taiwan to Okinawa, God's hand was truly on my stick as I took the flight through an incredibly violent series of storms, from Typhoon Helen to a landing in Oklahoma. And if I failed, one or more of my pilots and I would eject in the storm into the ocean with a limited chance of survival. In January, I was assigned to the Army 7th Infantry as the forward air controller. And my assigned area was the main invasion route from north through to Seoul. This was a very sobering time. I saw the ravages of war destroyed villages with orphanages filled with gaily colored children, clothed children, large groups of women without men. 4 fellow airmen died during my tour. One lived in my hooch, and I prepared his personal belongings to transfer home. In the words of our chaplain, when flying, we were 1 second from our judgment day. Fighter pilots have a marvelous perspective of God's creation. They're unlike any other. You see the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars like you will never see at any place on earth. We race through the cloud canyons, go cloud busting. We drive through incredibly violent storms and witness magnificent sunrises and sunsets beautiful beyond any imagination. And there, flying along, pilots normally will murmur the closing words of High Flight, the pilot's poem. It ends with, while silent lifting mind, I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. In February, I received a call from the Red Cross via the ham radio network. We had a daughter named Carmen, and the mother and the baby were fine. I wrote a long letter that night, thanked God, and celebrated with my fellow pilots. In returning to the States, I was given an assignment to fly tankers. I was elected to go to reserve status. I missed flying, and for many months, with great difficulty, I just could not accept the challenge that I was flying no more. Marta and I began a turbulent period, moving 5 times in 5 years. God was now our co-pilot, carrying both she and I in his hands, teaching us the skills needed to cope with life. I was now a flight test engineer on the B-52 aircraft at Halaman Air Force Base, developing the flight systems for the war. We loved New Mexico, the mountains, the desert, and we welcomed our second daughter, Lucy. Within only 2 years, the flight test program was ending. It was time for another change. Edwards Air Force Base to flight test the F-4 Phantom, or go to Omaha for Atlas rocket testing. But God again had directed my journey. Every fork on the road, every person along my journey, every success and every disappointment was part of God's plan. But now God decided it was time for a new flight plan. I saw an advertisement in Aviation Week, a trade journal. NASA was looking for qualified engineers to determine the feasibility of putting an American in space. I was hired off paper, never interviewed, and in 1960 reported to the Space Task Group headquarters at Langley Field in Virginia. I was selected to work by a man we later called the teacher, Christopher Columbus Kraft. And 2 weeks after reporting, I was sent to the Cape to write the countdown for the first Redstone launch. And together, Chris and I would write the textbook for manned spaceflight. Marta now had our 3rd child, Joan, and it was tough for her. I spent many long months at the Cape. Once again, she was on her own with the family and a new baby. Kraft assigned me as assistant flight director and then flight director for Gemini. We moved to Houston and 3 more children over the years. God was sitting at my console with me at the flight director's position on January 27, 1967. I was supporting the power-up of the pad test the day fire exploded in the spacecraft. And we listened to our 3 astronauts cry, "Fire, fire, fire." And there was no way we could help them. That fire changed all of our lives. And my life changed greatly. Kraft moved to his position as the assistant center director for Dr. Garuth. And I was assigned to his job as division chief for flight control, while also serving as flight director. Before missions, I always tried to receive communion and a blessing from Father Cargo as our parish priest at that time. I was on the council for every mission. There were no easy ones. The lunar landing was close, very close. We landed with only 17 seconds of fuel remaining. The return of the Apollo 13 crew was beyond our normal human skills, and I believe that as a team, we all received guidance from above. During the 70s, Marta and I became active in Shrine of the True Cross, the fall festivals. Marta became a Girl Scout leader. Catholic kids were going and joining the Methodist youth group, so I formed a CYO organization to provide an alternative. I taught CCD to the high school juniors and seniors. And as director of mission operations, I developed a new group of young controllers and carried them through the Challenger tragedy. I remained working in space for over 100 missions, leading America's space operations team, and I retired in 1994. I was often asked if I was stressed in my work, and my answer was no. I always felt the presence of God in my life. And he always gave me the ability to find the right words for my team and to give them the courage and confidence to face the risks of their work and to take any actions needed for crew safety and mission success. After 40 years in aviation and space, like Harry Carroll is still not used up. I returned to my first love. I flew 15 to 20 air shows per year in a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress. I built an aerobatic biplane in our garage. I moved into motivational speaking and authored a book. While writing the book, I recognized the many who shaped my life. In remembrance, I placed a brick at the entrance to Space Center Houston with their name and the lesson they had taught me. With my retirement, many of my people formed a Habitat affiliate in La Porte, Texas. And I did their fundraising for Habitat, YMCA of the Rockies, Toledo Central Catholic, and True Cross Church. And I re-engaged with the military. But somehow I felt something was missing. For much of my life, I had been a Sunday morning Catholic. I went to Mass, contributed to the church, confession several times a year, daily Mass during Lent and holy days. Then again, God was my co-pilot. A simple request from my daughter Carmen to serve as her guardian in the Eucharist, guardian of the Eucharist, refocused my life's priorities. Carmen was a guardian. She was a nurse, and due to conflict, she was asked, Marta and I, to take her scheduled hour. And for the first time in years, Marta and I sat in total silence in the chapel before the Blessed Sacrament. No distractions, no one else. Just time to sit quietly in the presence of God and say a few prayers and thank the Creator for each moment of each day. It was wonderful, peaceful. Martin and I signed up to become guardians. The next step in this part of our journey began with a rapidly developing relationship with our pastor, Father Paul Felix. Our Catholic faith then came into dead center in our lives. We began daily masses. Then we joined the morning group in prayers before Mass. 3 of our children became active in service to the church and community. Father Felix was reassigned and handed me over to Father Wilson, and then I served in the pastoral council, building committee, lector, Eucharistic minister, and we were hit by a flood and had to recover from that. Our family has been blessed in many ways. Looking back over the years, I know that nothing was chance or coincidence. God's mark was everywhere and on everything. God is my co-pilot, and the journey continues. And like Harry Carroll, I am not yet all used up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.